Press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from News Laundry. This is a News Laundry podcast and you're listening to NL Interviews.
Aatish Taseer is a British writer and journalist. Born to Indian journalist Tavleen Singh and late Pakistani politician Salman Taseer, Aatish has held the status of an overseas citizen of India until it was revoked by the Modi government early last month. In a tweet, Home Ministry spokesperson said that Aatish was guilty of concealing the fact that his late father was of Pakistani origin and was thus ineligible to hold an OCI card. Aatish has stated that this was a punishment meted out to him for criticizing Prime Minister Modi. In a Time magazine article that came out in May 2019, Aatish had tore into Modi's Hindutva politics. The headline of that piece was India's Divider-in-Chief. BJP obviously didn't take kindly to the piece.
सरकार का एक आर्टिकल हमने टाइम मैगजीन में देखा है। बंधु, उसका लेखक कौन है? उसका लेखक है एक पाकिस्तानी नागरिक। एक पाकिस्तानी नागरिक मोदी जी को डिवाइडर कहता है और राहुल गांधी उसको ट्वीट करते हैं।
I caught up with Aatish on Skype to discuss the issue of his citizenship, his connection with India, and all the criticism that has come his way. It's been about 3 weeks since the news of the Indian government cancelling your OCI card hit you. What have the past 3 weeks been like for you emotionally? Where are you at emotionally? What are the sort of range of feelings that you felt over the past 3 weeks?
So, in some respects, I'd seen it coming because I'd received the notice in September. But I have to say, the first feeling was like a sense of shock at the kind of violence of it. The fact that the government had been leaking to the press and that they were within seconds of the news breaking on Twitter and tweeting out against me, and that they canceled the document on Twitter, which I felt like there was a kind of Trumpian brutality to that sort of like, even though I was expecting it, I was kind of shocked.
Okay.
And then like, I have to say like, definitely a feeling of sadness because I had to actually hand the document in last week. And, you know, there's no way that you can go through a ceremony like that of going to the consulate and surrendering your the one thing that gives you status in India, and that you've kind of always almost taken as a sort of dual nationality, or taken as like being your sort of legal connection to a place like India, which for me, obviously, there's so many emotional ties. I couldn't have done something like that without feeling like a sense of sadness or a sense of goodbye. I've also felt a degree of anger, and I feel like my blood is up a little bit. Like before, there was a kind of sense of resignation, and I was like, okay, this is happening. I'll walk away. I'll go off to another life. I'll like almost acceptance. And then when it happened, and I suddenly like the mood changed, and I was like, no, I will fight these guys. I will wait it out. I'll fight it in every legal channel that I have, but I'll also fight it in the court of public opinion. And I'll make it known that what this government is about, that they shouldn't. I felt a very strong sense that Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah should not be able to, if they should not be able to have a double image. They shouldn't be able to play the statesman abroad and the despot at home. I was like, I will do what I can to expose these guys.
So you've got quite a lot of support from the international community. You've had writers write in support of you. You've had PEN come out support you. CPJ come out support you. Have you been sort of, like you said...
Support, to stop you, Manisha, support in India as well, you know. It's one thing for the Hindu to write an editorial. It's one thing for the Indian Express to write an editorial, or the Deccan Chronicle. But for the Times of India, most apolitical paper in the world, to come out with an editorial and be like, what the fuck is going on? Like that, for me, it's like a deeper level of support.
Yeah, and Times is not known to sort of take these stances, and they're like you said, they're not somebody who'd really take on the government for things that they do. But because
and everyone could recognize the malice in it. They could see that this was not some silly procedural thing that the government was trying to make it seem. Like they could see that what they were doing was basically weaponizing immigration laws.
But because you said that you want to sort of not let Modi and Shah have this sort of dual image, have you been, apart from speaking for the press, have you been sort of Is this something that you think of now actively, that you need to sort of speak to more people, talk about the government, talk about what it's up to, whether through your journalism or your writing or through conferences? Is this something that you're actively planning to sort of do?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason I'm speaking to you, the reason I've written about it, the reason that I have I have a documentary film coming out, which basically deals with the rise of Modi through Muslim eyes. But it also deals with now, because suddenly the presenter can no longer go back to the country to finish the film. It also deals with my situation. And I wouldn't, if it was the situation, if I saw it as a situation of one individual, if I didn't see in it a shade of what's happening, the unconstitutionality of what's happening in Kashmir or the CAB or the NRC, if I didn't see a pattern, if I didn't see that very soon after what they did to me, they went after Mehta Patkar in a different way. Again, like weaponizing laws to go after critics, I probably wouldn't pursue it. But I think it's important to pursue because this is the character of this. I want to say government. I almost said regime.
So I want to take you back to 2014 to a piece that you wrote for The Open, and you were reporting from Banaras back then. And I think this was your last dispatch from Banaras, and you say that in the piece that I have sympathy for Modi, and if I wish to see him succeed, it's because of my sympathy for the people who support him. You say that it's this India, clear-headed, restless, hungry, that has energized this election. It is the India that some of us have been waiting to see come into being. It is also my concern for this India that has prejudiced my view of this election. So I just want you to go back to that time where you aren't someone who immediately you'd call a dissident, because some of your reporting back then was, if not optimistic, it was sort of willing to give Modi a chance. Let's put it like that. So what were you seeing back then? And how do you view it today?
One thing that I found very moving about that election, and I still maintain that it was an election of hope. There may have been like menacing things in the wings. There may have been all of this stuff. But what I do feel very strongly is that I would see people constantly correct journalists, reporters, when they would drive home this, tell us about the temple, tell us about communalism, tell us about Hindu Rashtra. And they would always stop them and say, listen, we're voting for him because we think he's going to bring prosperity. We think he's going to bring vikas. And I thought, well, a man like this with this kind of background, if he's making the right noises, firstly, I thought there was a kind of inevitability that someone like this would emerge. But more than that, I thought we have to follow this arc. We have to see what this kind of, if this man has the potential for the kind of growth that he seems to be hinting at, he should be allowed to show that. I have to say that obviously it was a bitter disappointment because he was a wrecking ball to the economy. And as soon as that side of it didn't work, and I think his limitations were too great. I think he didn't know what he was meant to do. But when that didn't work, all the bad stuff came pouring out in double measure. And so I'm the first to admit to you that I misjudged it, or I was not perhaps grave enough in my reservations. But I will say that at the same time, before he was elected, I'd published a novel called The Way Things Were. And for a writer, that's almost a deeper testament. And it is about about a Sanskritist who has to leave India because his tradition is sort of spoiled by nationalism. It's weaponized, or it's turned into something toxic, and this Sanskritist has to leave the country. And so I was dealing with many different moods at the same time. And when one is walking in a political vein, one is not necessarily evoking or invoking, rather, the deepest level of one's like cultural judgments or, of analysis. And so it sounds like a weak defense, but what I'm saying is that there were many different things going on at that point.
I don't know. So Way Things Were was before the elections.
Yeah.
I thought it was after for some reason. Okay. So because that book really deals with the sort of the rise of the right and the sort of cultural imposition that may bring. So
exactly. I very much had this sense.
It's interesting
the kind of
because
world that Mr. Modi would bring into being would be a world in which I was not welcome in India. And so even on a personal level, my willingness to have a life in America or to sort of settle elsewhere, I would never have done that in that decade before when I was really committed to being in India. And I kind of on a personal level, I think I saw that this was not a society where I would be welcome, and I was open to being somewhere else in a way that I would never have been before.
So it's interesting you say that, because in the same piece you also talk about, you say that Modi shouldn't go the Erdogan way, and you say that you wouldn't want India to become a place where anyone with a harsh word to say about the prime minister will be driven out of town. And
right.
So I from your writing, it did seem like you were kind of at least aware of what it could mean, but you were hoping that it wouldn't. It almost seems like you were hoping that your fears about the person would not come true. And
right.
a lot of your journalism
I'd seen that
was
rise of Erdogan. Sorry to interrupt you, but I'd seen that, and I'd seen the direction that it had taken. And I guess what I hoped was that since India was so unique in the history of developing countries, that it had this tradition that even places like Spain and Greece had not had in the 20th century, that there was this kind of unbroken arc of democracy and of institutions, and that India had this special place in the history of the world, that maybe India's sort of demagogue or India's answer to now all these leaders would also be different, and that Indian institutions would hold, and a man like this could be contained.
So in this piece, you describe a Modi supporter as clear-headed, restless and hungry. And you've had a lot of run-ins with Modi supporters on internet, at least. How would you, 3 words that you'd use to describe a Modi supporter today? Do you still view them as clear-headed, restless and hungry?
No. I feel that actually that a lot of the kind of hope that they put in him has sort of curdled, and I would really see them much more as desperate, toxic, and ready to turn their disappointment against the world. And also to separate, I don't mean the kind of Modi supporter we see on Twitter. At that time too, I meant somebody on the ground who had hopes of Mr. Modi, which is kind of a different person from the Twitterverse, when you encounter that person who is a young man who has aspirations, or a young woman who wants things to go well in a certain way, and is kind of part of the energy of India, that sort of restlessness, which even then had the possibility to turn sour, could also be it could be quite a moving thing, and it was hard as a writer, an Indian writer, to not feel a sensitivity towards it.
I'm going to throw at you some of the criticisms that have come your way since the cancellation of your card. And I'd like you to tackle them. And if you think they're too personal, then feel free to not tackle them. But
nothing's too personal. You can throw anything you like my way.
So I tweeted one of your article that you wrote in the Time right after the cancellation, and I think you mentioned in that you've always viewed your mother as your sole legal guardian, and it's her identity that you took after. And I got some responses to that saying that if that is so, why is he Taseer? And why not sing? So do you want to tackle that? Why did you?
Sure. I mean, firstly, kind of an odd thing to say, because who chooses their own name? So let's say right in the beginning that it was my mother who gave me that name. My sense was that she gave it to me to protect me, because it was bad enough to not have a father, but to be, I suppose, a love child or an illegitimate child, a bastard, if one wanted to be cruel. It was an added layer of social difficulty. And I think that my mother would have wanted to spend most of the 80s and early 90s, as I was growing up, trying to bring a veneer of respectability to what was basically a kind of scandalous relationship. So that was probably why she gave me his name, and why there was a kind of why there was a sort of pretense that what had really been a love affair was something more substantial. But again, I mean, and then after a while, your name is your name. It just feels odd at 18 to give up your name.
Yeah.
But that was the reason.
Another thing that's being brought up is your piece piece the day I got my green card. Now, this column, you talk about getting your American citizenship, and you talk about finally being home and having a feeling that you've never really had for any other country. And a lot of people have I've sort of thrown that article back at you to say that, well, I mean, your love for your country was never really real, or that it wasn't really something that mattered to you too much, because here's your piece where you're rejoicing your, green card, and almost kind of saying that this country is special to you in a way that India never was. So I just want you to, tackle that for us. And then I have a few questions on that.
So let me respond in this way, which is that firstly, like, since then, I've written a book like The Twice Born, which is steeped in my love of India. And that piece really for me was dealing more with national cultures. In India, I suppose I've always made a separation. Probably a lot of people make this separation between the reality of the modern Indian state and obviously much deeper reservoir of affection and belonging, which is related to Indian culture stretching back, thousands of years. And so this, I guess what I was talking about, and by the way, for those people who think I was concealing my whatever identity, I mentioned that I have a PIO card in that piece. And I mentioned this whole story of my father's relationship to Pakistan, his origins and stuff. And I guess what I was discussing in that was really, it was a piece about getting a green card. And it was discussing these, like, the gap between documents associated with a nation state and belonging in a deeper sense. And in America, for me, that relationship is much closer. Like, when you get an American passport, when you're born in America, that means something in America, the way it never means the same thing in Britain or India or Pakistan. In those countries, people are always looking for some deeper level of identity. So like an Indian Muslim is never accepted on face value and say, people are always looking at you to say, are you part of this deeper belonging? And I guess the relief that I felt in America, which I still feel, is that once you get the piece of paper actually matters.
Is that true?
If anything, this has been borne out even more truly by my experience recently, where someone has snatched my piece of paper in India. They've told me that it doesn't matter a jot. And in America, there is a safety about that legal document that is quite real. And so that was really the deeper vibrations of what that piece was about. It was not saying that, India, where I've lived all my life and which I've written about and continue to write about, suddenly doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, but I think it's also possible to hate a country for many things and then also have a deep relationship with it. I think a lot of us do. We do have moments where we're completely frustrated with India and we find it to be, and you have really not very affectionate thoughts about your country, but still love it. Was that also something that you were trying to explore?
Absolutely. And certainly on the level where India expresses itself in the culture of the modern Indian state, there would be many, many people who would experience that sense of hating it on one level and yet being tied to it or loving it on a much deeper level. And actually, to extend your point, not just on the level of the nation state, Indian culture, Indian religion, as much as it has a power to kind of evoke wonder and affection and love, there are many things that are venal and horrible about it. And I suppose you only write in that way about your place if you are in some ways kind of attached to it. You don't write with that much urgency or with that much at stake if you didn't care, So
what are the aspects of India that you hate, and what are the aspects of India that you love? If you were to kind of revisit things that you were going through when you were talking about your green card or feeling at home, what are the things that draw you to India, and what are the things that make you feel, okay, this is probably where I don't belong? Well,
in a very personal way, I've said that, for instance, one of the things that I had always loved about India was that I felt that a certain kind of big-heartedness, which in my life had expressed itself very much through the figure of my grandparents, who were not extremely westernized. They were part of an older generation, and they were confronted with the scandal of my parents' relationship. And many people could have responded in a very in a very narrow, very vindictive way. And they responded with nothing but like love and an openness and a feeling of like making me know that this was my family, this was my country. And it may sound like that was an individual example, but I've always felt that that big-heartedness has been part of the Indian character. In fact, one of the things that really upset me recently was this story of Feroz Khan at BHU. And, because of the twice born, I've been very familiar with the Sanskrit department at BHU. And I thought, here's this man, and his father would sing bhajans, and he learned Sanskrit well enough to become a professor at BHU. And he was not operating out of some Western sense of openness and liberality. He was operating out of a very Indian sense of what syncretic culture meant, what India on its deepest level, that ability that it had to throw up these amazing combinations to kind of to produce hybrid culture in this way. And in the new India, or in this India that kind of Mr. Modi and Shah would like to see come into being, a man like that who is working within tradition has suddenly been forced out. He's suddenly confronted with black-heartedness, with mean-spiritedness. He's confronted with an India where he's not welcome. And so you see almost like in that one example, both sides of what I love about India and also what I find absolutely horrible, and I think that culture that we have of the possibility of the lynch mob, of the possibility of this society that has produced probably some of the deepest levels of assimilation known in history, can also turn against you, can also drive you out, where this thing is simmering away under the surface. And even with this experience that I've had recently, as much as there's been support, there's also been a lot of like ugly schadenfreude, people kind of delighting in my situation. And I feel like that is something that it's a very self-wounding part of our character, If you think that it's a good thing that an Indian writer like myself can't return home, you should really worry about yourself.
In fact, even some quarters of the liberal set have sort of said that, okay, you've been taken down by the forces that you cheered for, or for the forces that you felt were great for India. And so, too bad. Did you encounter that? How did you respond to that?
I don't think that's a very fair assessment of my work. But more than that, like, even if it was true, even if I thought that something good would come of this guy, and by the way, the minute really bad signs started to appear, almost at the exact moment of the Akhlaq lynching, I took a very resolute position. I completely parted ways with whatever belief that I had before, and I've maintained that throughout. So this business of delighting in the misfortune of others, like it's firstly a stupid thing to do, because in the end, like, you have to live in this place, and if it's changing in these ways, you'll be affected by that too. But also because, like, it's an emotion that has historically been part of our behavior, and it's something that I think we should try to expunge.
Another criticism that's come your way is, and this is, I mean, it's not really criticism, but it's I don't know if you read the Asia Times piece on your privilege. And so there are a lot of people who've said that, you're a privileged person and your mother's someone who's privileged. She's had access to politicians. She's supported Modi and Shah. And there's a sort of expectation that because, we've been supportive, we deserve better. Or that this question of your card being taken away is not that important because, you left India anyway and you were never really an Indian citizen and you've delighted, so to speak, in your American citizenship and that. So, but for you, you've said that this was...
There are like a couple of different things going on. Firstly, I'm not an American citizen. I'm a green card holder because of my husband. But I was born a British citizen.
Yeah.
When I was 18, my mother and I, one of the things that I was very much seriously considering was taking Indian citizenship, because never in a million years did I dream that I would not be living in India. It's the country where I've lived most of my life. It's where I returned after college. And the only reason I didn't take it at that point was because this thing had come into being, and it seemed very much like it didn't have to be an either or situation. And so I took advantage of something that the government was offering. I don't think that that's like a wildly like cynical, privileged thing, entitled thing to do. I mean, it was a scheme that the government offered, and we should not like create these like binaries where you're like, oh my God, if you don't take Indian citizenship, you don't love India. Like
Yeah.
that's a. I mean, the government was actively welcoming people with a connection to India. I had an obvious connection to India, and I took advantage of the government scheme. But more importantly, like this business of like, are we really getting onto the level of class warfare where we say, like, because somebody is privileged, it doesn't matter that they can't return home. It doesn't matter that they can't see their like mother and grandmother. It doesn't matter that they can't be with their concerns as a writer. I mean, it's a really crazy thing to say. And to ask me at this point now, when you've seen that the government has shown obvious malice towards me to become an Indian citizen. And, I have in a much more serious situation, which is that, like, I'm married in America to a man, and I don't know if Ryan would be okay for my one citizenship to be that of a country which doesn't recognize our marriage. And so there are many things that have come subsequently. But I just find
actually,
this
that's
line
a very
of attack,
important
like,
point
it's a
you bring up.
it's a sort of level of class warfare that should give us all pause,
Yeah, and I think, personally, I found some of those questions a bit stifling also because, there was also the question of, but how is he contributing to the country? Or that you have like Sudha Bhardwaj who came back and worked in India, or you had a Jean de Ries who comes back and works in Calcutta. I find that a bit,
I came back right after college and was in India till just the other day. It's only because of marriage that, like 3 or 4 years ago, that I left India. Every one of my books has been steeped in Indian concerns. Like what? Unless you believe that writers have no contribution,
exactly.
It's a bit insane to say that like I haven't contributed to India.
Yeah, and I think that's why I find it a bit stifling especially for a writer or a journalist to have that thrown at you, and that happens quite often. Like, what exactly are you doing for your country? But I think what he's trying to emphasize is that this is not a battle that we should concern ourselves with, that India has other concerns. But you've also said that you're not looking at this as your own battle. You're seeing a pattern here where...
I think there's a very clear pattern.
And then you somehow look at this in the same way as you look at NRC, or that something like this could start happening to other people where laws are weaponized to sort of, use it against people who are critical.
I think there's a very clear pattern. It's what I see happening is a very conscious, very unconstitutional attempt to make the idea of being Indian correspond with being Hindu. And that's playing out in various ways. And I don't think that my own situation is that like isolated. And if it wasn't linked to this other thing, maybe we could set it aside. But I mean, it's so interesting that almost within a few days after me, they should go off. I haven't been a supporter of Medha Patkar, but I think it's appalling what's happening to her.
So I wanted to ask you, there's been a lot of confusion about your card and how you got it and what did you say in the form and all that. So I just was wondering if you could clear it up for our listeners. So you had a PIO card, right? Which then automatically...
which my mother applied for when I was in college. I was in college in America, and my mother had gone habitually to the FRRO. And when she went, as I was sort of like around the age of 18 or 19, whenever, it would have been 2000, I think. And she would have gone, and the only thing at contention is this application she made. And they said to her, Madam ji, aap ye le le, ye naya scheme humne banaya hai. And she said very clearly, I'm a single mother. This is my son. And she gave my birth certificate. So my father's name was on the card, etc. What she didn't provide, and she could never have provided, was my father's citizenship document. And she claims she was never asked for it. And in some ways, she must be right, because if this document was so critical, if she was like concealing my father's identity, then why would they issue me the PIO? So I don't know if it was a level of bureaucratic confusion, bureaucratic laxity, but the fact is that she provided the only documents she could have. And if they had said to her, listen, well, if you can't provide a citizenship document, we won't give you this thing. Well, then fine, they would have been in the right. They obviously had a certain amount of latitude. And I feel like afterwards, and governments are entitled to do this. Like governments are not just like blotter, jotter, legalese. Like any government could like look at a broader situation. I've clearly had a public life in which I've been very open about my circumstances. If a government didn't want to go after me, they could say, listen, there's some confusion with this. Could you come in? Let's find a way to resolve it. A lot of governments would feel that is something that they were A, within their power to do, and B, that if they had the power to grant an exemption, why not grant it to someone who's grown up in India all his life with a single mother and who's obviously rooted in India and has not been a Pakistani? So like, we shouldn't like lose, I guess, what is that metaphor? Like lose the trees for the forest or whatever. I mean, what is happening here is something very clear. And if it was simply a matter of a bureaucratic discrepancy, it could also be cleared up. But the government hasn't chosen that route. And moreover, they've chosen a special route in which I'm blacklisted. So you'll notice that there's been quite a lot of public attention to what's happened. But I was in the consulate on Monday, and the consulate, as far as I know, neither the Home Ministry nor the Consul General has changed their original position that if my card was taken away on these grounds, I would be blacklisted and not able to get a normal visa for India.
So this PIO card then turned into an OCI card, right? It just,
right, for which I didn't even meet a person. It was literally like a digital form, a mailing in, one thing, like I sent out one thing and got the other thing back.
So she didn't really leave a blank column in the form, or she did put your father's name there, but she couldn't have provided the citizenship documents, obviously, because they weren't in touch. Right. And so how... Of course, a lot of the first thing about you, the first mention, or when I think people knew about your father, but the first time that you were really being called a Pakistani, or that you've been associated with a Pakistani political family, was after your Time magazine article. At that time, did you just laugh it off, or did you think that this is going to come back at me, or this is going to be sort of taken up in a way that's going to effectively stop me from maybe entering India again? Was it like...
Not at all. In fact, the only thing I took seriously, I set aside the trolling, the vandalizing the Wikipedia page, the Amazon, all of those things. I was like, forget that. That's just part of having a thick hide and writing what you want. And as far as I was concerned, I was not worried about that. The only thing, in fact, I think there's an NDTV interview from that time, where the only thing that worries me is that Sambit Patra has started to circulate this lie that I'm a Pakistani, and the Prime Minister has picked up the lie. And if there's really anybody who should apologize, it shouldn't be me. He should apologize for having circulated a lie that I knew at that point would be very damaging to me.
So you were aware at that time. You didn't find
in a year of hostilities, either you're exposing me to violence, which could very well happen because, like, you call someone a Pakistani and you know how that goes down in 2019 in India. And I said, and if not, then some form of harassment, and literally like clockwork that came to a kind of fruition with this OCI business, which the Consul General was very clear. He's like, it's coming straight from Amit Shah. It's coming from the Home Ministry.
So it did scare you back then. You didn't like brush it off as
absolutely. I'm on record saying that it's the only thing that scared me.
Coming back to your writerly life, you and some of your time when you were actively doing journalism in India, you've never really been very cozy with what is called the Delhi's left liberal circle. You did that really funny interview with yourself for The Nervous Breakdown. Where you take a dig at the gatekeepers of Delhi's intellectual scene. And so, and you had these literary sort of fights that were also reported, or not really fights, but, But what you do have a lot in common with these people now is a dislike for Modi. So right. do you see yourself, have you got any support from those quarters in India? And do you see yourself wanting to sort of maybe be in the in circle now, or try and reach out to sort of the people that you were earlier not very fond of or scoffed at?
It's an interesting question.
Do you see a broader alliance?
Say, like, there's one thing that both in America and in India that I would say is part of a little bit of the fairness of people on the left, is that when this happened to me, someone who might have been kind of an ardent critic of mine, like Mihir Sharma, wrote a piece in my defense. That guy Abhijit Iyer Mitra, when he was arrested, like, people did come out to speak in his defense. And people have on my side too. And it is a strange situation. You're like, well, like now that you're both opponents of what's happening, are you kind of in the same, is your kind of friend's enemy or whatever, your friend, or, however that saying goes. But, at the same time, for me, the reason why I was a very strong critic of what we describe as liberal left-wing politics in India is because I think that old world that we were part of did fail us and continues to fail us. And nothing is sort of more real evidence of it than the fact that like the limitations that I saw in that society are borne out by the fact of the disarray that we see within the Congress party. The fact that once again, Rahul Gandhi is going to be put before the people. Once again, the sort of total intellectual, philosophical, like impoverishment of that other side is going to be like exposed. And so it's, as much as we can criticize this new populism, we should also know that there was a critique of our society that was implicit in it, that we shouldn't ignore. Even in America, as much as Trump is no solution, he did become the expression of a criticism that we should consider very seriously. And so these are it's not as simple as saying like now I'm on this side and we'll all be friends. It's recognizing that both things can exist simultaneously.
What about as a writer? Most of your books, like you said, they're steeped in India. Are you a little worried for the literary work that you do? Are you worried about, because you may not have access to India the way you did earlier? Is that a worry for you? Also, I think sometimes for writers, I mean, at least this is what it's said, that they kind of thrive in sort of when their lives are thrown into chaos, because that becomes material and they're kind of pushed. So how are you viewing this for yourself as a writer? Are you seeing this as an opportunity, or are you worried about the work that you're doing?
So a couple of things. One is that we tend to romanticize the idea of exile, and we think of people like Nabokov and that exile was in some ways their making. But there's also a very sterile side of exile. There's a possibility that one could be in another country and be desperately homesick and thinking of another place all the time, and that it's not necessary that state is a creative state. And as a writer who's needed India more than a lot of my sort of coevals, I do sometimes worry that of the harm that could be done to me if I was deprived of my material, or if I was deprived of this country that's nourished me in many ways. And one of the weird things, like, which is, I have a very strong connection to Indian myth and religion, to Hindu India. And one of the things, my mother is here at the moment. One of the things, like, almost the first thing I had her bring me was a Hindi version of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, because I somehow I felt like a need to be close to some part of India now that the idea of going back had been taken away from me. And so I don't know, to answer your question, how it will play out creatively, but I'm very aware that it's not necessary that it could be good for me. And the other thing that I feel very much is this business that, India, Osip Mandelstam used to say that Russia is the only place where they love poets because you can be killed for being a poet, that there was this kind of, the literature mattered in a sort of, in almost a fundamental sort of way. In India, I feel like there's been a tendency to kill writers with neglect, and it's not just the fact that I feel like people like Salman Rushdie, Vikram Seth, that if they hadn't had this other world in which their talent could have been recognized, they would have been buried in India. But, someone like V.S. Naipaul, who had come back, and I think he'd also wanted an OCI. And the BJP government told him, well, do you have your papers? Do you have your grandfather's birth certificate? He's like, my whole work has been dedicated to the fact that we were sent as indentured servants to the Caribbean. And so this business of failing one's writers and of kind of like of doing a disservice to the talent that comes out of India. I find that like people should really worry about that side of things, because it's it's not good for the health of a country when people who are invested in that country are driven away.
Just one more question I want to ask you was,
Sure.
So today, if say you wanted to come to India for a journalistic project or for a writing project, can you apply for a visa and get it and come? Or, I mean, how is that? Or are you just barred? What's your current status right now?
What the Consul General indicated to me was that if my OCI was cancelled on the grounds that I had concealed material information, that I had basically committed fraud, that I would then be blacklisted. And I can actually send you this, it's very clearly said on the Home Ministry website as well. So as far as I know, I've been told that I'm blacklisted.
Okay. So best of luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, dear subscribers, for tuning in, and thanks a lot for your support. As you all know, at News Laundry, we don't depend on advertisements from either the government or corporations to sustain ourselves. We depend on news consumers. So thanks a lot for your support, and do spread the word. Pay to keep news free.
All the News Laundry podcasts are available on Stitcher, iTunes, and any other podcast platform.
Please subscribe to News Laundry. Help us keep news independent. To catch all our podcasts on news, pop culture, current affairs and sport, visit newslaundry.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.